Right now, underneath a stretch of coastline just west of Naples, nearly 1 million people are eating dinner, walking dogs, tucking kids into bed, with no idea that a few kilometers beneath their kitchen floors, something just cracked open a little further. On July 31st, 2026, at 7:46 in the evening, the ground near the town of Pozzuoli let go. A magnitude 4.7 earthquake, shallow, sudden, and strong enough to be the biggest jolt this volcanic system has produced in roughly 40 years. To put that number somewhere, you can actually feel it. This single quake released more raw energy than an entire earlier swarm of nearly 1,000 smaller tremors combined, because earthquake energy doesn't add up in a straight line. It explodes upward with every small step in magnitude, the way a fire doubles in size every time it finds a little more fuel. And I know a title like Europe's supervolcano just took a terrifying turn sounds like clickbait, dressed up as science, but that's not quite the full picture. And by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why that title is more careful than it sounds. Here's what you're going to walk away knowing: why a shallow earthquake can do more damage than a much bigger one somewhere else, what scientists are actually watching for as the real warning sign, the specific thing that would tell them this is escalating instead of just continuing, and what any of this means if you're the kind of person who wonders how a city can sit on top of something like this every single day without thinking about it. I want to be upfront with you right now. We're going to sit in the scary part first, the actual mechanics of what's happening underground, before we get anywhere near the reassuring part. That's not an accident. Understanding the danger, honestly, is what makes the reassurance actually mean something later. So let's talk about where we actually are, because the geography here is stranger than most people expect. This is Campi Flegrei, and unlike the volcano pictures stuck in your head from movies, there's no mountain here. No cone rising into the sky, no peak to point a camera at from a distance, nothing that looks remotely dangerous from a rooftop. It's a caldera, which is just the word for a huge collapsed crater, roughly 12 to 13 kilometers across. That's large enough that entire neighborhoods of western Naples and the town of Pozzuoli are built directly inside it, the way a small town might be built inside the rim of an enormous bowl without anyone ever noticing the bowl is there. Italian scientists themselves classify this as a supervolcano in their own published research. This isn't internet exaggeration, and it isn't a YouTube thumbnail stretching the truth. It's the actual scientific term used by the people who study it for a living, and its history backs that classification up completely. 40,000 years ago, Campi Flegrei produced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in European history, an event so massive it spread ash across a huge stretch of the continent and may have altered the climate for years afterward, cooling temperatures and disrupting ecosystems far beyond Italy's borders. 15,000 years ago, it erupted again, a slightly smaller event that shaped much of the rock and the hills you can still walk across around Naples today. And its most recent eruption in 1538 was tiny compared to those ancient events, but it did something almost impossible to picture. It built a brand new mountain out of flat ground in about a week. Try to actually sit with that for a second. Flat farmland turning into a hill tall enough to stand on in 7 days, displacing the people who lived there at the time. It hasn't erupted since 1538, but quiet isn't the same thing as asleep, and that difference is the entire reason we're talking about this today. Here's one image I want you to hold on to because we're going to come back to it more than once throughout this video. Picture this entire system like a pressure cooker that's been sitting on a low flame for centuries, sealed tight with the lid bolted down. Underneath that lid, heat, gas, and superheated water keep arriving and keep pushing upward, the same way steam builds inside a covered pot, even when the burner is turned down low. The lid isn't blowing off all at once. It's fracturing just a little more every time a fresh pulse of pressure hits it from below. Now here's the detective part of the story, because this is where things get genuinely interesting instead of just alarming. A short drive from the epicenter of that July earthquake sit the ruins of an old Roman marketplace, its marble columns still standing after roughly 2,000 years. If you look closely at those columns at eye level, you'll find tiny holes bored straight into the stone. Those holes were made by a small saltwater creature that only lives underwater, boring into surfaces the way a woodpecker bores into a tree, which means, at some point in history, that entire marketplace was sitting below sea level, submerged with those columns underwater, long enough for a marine creature to move in and make itself at home. Then, somehow, the ground rose back up out of the ocean, high enough that people could eventually walk through that same marketplace again on dry land. Scientists didn't need satellites or seismographs to discover that this ground has a long memory of rising and falling. The rock told on itself, sitting in plain sight in a tourist attraction for anyone who knew what to look for. That same slow breathing, the ground physically rising and then sinking over years and sometimes decades, is called bradycism. And it's the exact same phenomenon quietly powering everything happening today. That slow rise has been accelerating hard since around 2005, and especially since 2020. As of this year, the ground at the very center of the caldera has lifted more than 1 full meter total. To put that somewhere, you can actually picture it. That's roughly the height of a kitchen counter, pushed upward from underneath an entire city, one sliver of a millimeter at a time, day after day, for years. It's a scale of ground movement comparable to a well-known crisis the same region went through in the early 1980s, except this time the buildup has been stretched out over a much longer stretch of time without yet fully releasing. This is the point where I want to press pause on the escalation, because here's what all of this does not mean. One strong earthquake, even a genuinely destructive one, is not scientific proof that an eruption is coming next week, or even next year. No credible volcanologist watching this system is making that specific claim, and anyone telling you otherwise is skipping past decades of actual research to get a more exciting headline. Calderas this size can rumble, groan, and slowly build pressure for years, sometimes for multiple generations, without ever actually reaching an eruption at all. It's entirely possible for this whole episode to plateau and quietly fade, the exact same way a similar crisis did back in the early 1980s, when a swarm of quakes led to a partial evacuation of part of Pozzuoli, relocated thousands of people into newly built housing, and then, over time, the unrest calmed back down without an eruption ever happening. That's genuinely possible here too. It has happened before in this exact location, and that brings us straight to a myth that needs killing right now because it's already spreading through comment sections underneath every single story about this earthquake. This is not a hidden government cover-up, and it's not scientists exaggerating a nothing story just to justify their own funding or grab attention. It's almost the exact opposite of that. Italy's National Geological Monitoring Agency runs one of the densest, most transparent volcanic surveillance networks anywhere on the planet. Seismic sensors, scattered across the region, listen for the smallest tremors. GPS stations track the ground's rise and fall down to the millimeter continuously every single day. Gas monitoring equipment constantly samples the steaming, hissing vents nearby in a place that's been a tourist attraction for centuries, and a live scientific instrument at the exact same time. Every single number in this video comes from data these scientists publish openly, specifically because burying it or downplaying it would put far more people at risk than explaining it honestly ever could. Let's get back into the actual numbers for a moment, because 2025 was already a record year for seismic activity in the system, including a magnitude 4.6 in June and another 4.6 in March, both strong events in their own right. Then, on July 31st, 2026, this new magnitude 4.7 became the single strongest event of the entire unrest episode, and it arrived after more than 90 additional smaller earthquakes struck the surrounding area in just a matter of hours, forming what seismologists call a swarm, meaning a tightly clustered burst of activity packed close together in both time and location. Seismologists don't just count how many tremors happen. They measure the actual energy being released, because that number tells a very different story than a simple head count does. And by that measure, this single 4.7 quake reportedly released more cumulative seismic energy than an entire earlier swarm of roughly 1,000 smaller tremors combined. A magnitude 4.7 releases something on the order of 3 times more energy than a 4.4, because earthquake energy scales exponentially with magnitude, not in a straight line the way most people naturally assume it does. One earthquake doing the work of 1,000 tremors. That's exactly why scientists watch the single biggest event in any sequence far more closely than they watch the raw earthquake count on any given day. So what's actually happening underground, physically, to cause all of this? Forget the old disaster movie image of one giant tank of liquid magma sitting directly under Naples like a bomb waiting to go off. That's simply not what modern surveys show anymore. Using seismic imaging, which essentially means listening carefully to how sound waves move through different layers of rock, and resistivity mapping, which tracks how electrical current moves through the ground. Researchers have identified a cap rock layer sitting above the deeper magmatic system. Think of it like the lid on that pressure cooker we talked about earlier, a lid that's been sealed for centuries. And it's the exact thing currently holding everything back while hot fluids, gases, and superheated water push against it from below, fracturing it a little more with every new pulse of pressure. Most of the shallow earthquakes shaking Pozzuoli right now appear to be driven by this hydrothermal system specifically, meaning superheated fluid and gas forcing their way through networks of tiny fractures, rather than fresh magma punching directly toward the surface. That distinction matters enormously, because hydrothermal-driven earthquakes and magma-driven earthquakes behave very differently underground, and they carry very different implications for what might come next. Deeper down, the actual magmatic system itself isn't a lake of lava at all. Geologists call it a mush zone, which is mostly a solid crystal structure with small pockets of liquid melt trapped in between the crystals. Picture wet sand sitting at low tide instead of an open swimming pool. Wet sand holds its shape. It resists sudden movement. It doesn't slosh around freely the way a pool of liquid would. These systems typically include separate magma lenses, sills, and dikes scattered across different depths, rather than one single unified chamber sitting underneath the whole city. That's exactly why the old textbook picture of one big chamber of lava waiting under Naples has been quietly retired by the researchers who actually study the system for a living. Now here's the genuinely uncertain part, and honestly, the part most worth sitting with rather than rushing past, because a channel that only tells you the confident parts isn't being fully honest with you. Scientists have also flagged deeper activity across the wider volcanic arc that this whole region sits within, the same tectonic zone where one geological plate slowly slides underneath another, grinding and buckling far below the surface. This is the same broader system responsible for Mount Vesuvius nearby, the volcano that buried the ancient city of Pompeii in 79 AD for Mount Etna. In Sicily, one of the most consistently active volcanoes on the entire planet, and for Marsilli, a genuinely massive underwater volcano sitting out in the Tyrrhenian Sea that remains barely studied simply because it's so difficult to physically reach. Earlier this year, the region recorded a deep earthquake roughly 375 kilometers straight down southeast of Naples, a depth so extreme that researchers still can't fully explain the exact mechanism behind it, since earthquakes at that depth likely involve mineral changes happening deep inside the rock rather than an ordinary fault simply snapping. Whether that extremely deep event connects at all to the shallow unrest right under Naples is a genuinely open question. Honest researchers won't claim a link they can't actually prove, and I'm not going to pretend to know something they don't either. It's worth pausing here for a moment, because the human side of this story matters just as much as the geology does. Naples is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in all of Europe. Greek settlers built here. Roman emperors ruled from nearby. Medieval kingdoms rose and fell across these same hills. And modern families have built their entire lives directly on top of the same caldera, generation after generation. This isn't some empty hazard zone that people deliberately chose to avoid, the way you might avoid building a house on a known floodplain. It's working ports, ancient ruins, crowded apartment blocks, corner cafes, and ordinary daily life, all layered directly on top of ground that has never fully stopped breathing beneath them. Somewhere between hundreds of thousands and close to 1 million people live across this wider area today. There's currently no evacuation order in place. Italian civil protection authorities continue monitoring the situation through an official alert system that's already been raised from green to yellow in recent years, without reaching the highest level, which is reserved specifically for a judged imminent eruption. Older residents in the area still remember that early 1980s crisis vividly. Its own earthquake swarms led to a partial temporary evacuation of part of Pozzuoli, relocating thousands of people into newly built housing while officials assessed the risk. What researchers are now stressing carefully is that this current episode has already exceeded that 1980s crisis in scale, in duration, and in total ground deformation, even though the 1980s crisis remains the reference point most local residents still measure everything against today. So, is an eruption actually coming? The honest answer has to be layered, because oversimplifying it in either direction does a real disservice to the people actually living on top of this thing every single day. One magnitude 4.7 earthquake, even a genuinely destructive one, does not by itself mean an eruption is coming within days or weeks. No credible volcanologist studying the system is making that specific claim right now. Calderas this size can build unrest for years, or even decades, before anything eruptive happens at all, and it's entirely possible for this to plateau and quiet back down without ever reaching an eruption, the exact same way it has done before in the system's own recorded history. But downplaying the situation would be just as dishonest as overhyping it. The trend since 2020 really is exceptional by the system's own recorded history, and that caprock does appear to be undergoing real, measurable fracturing, based on earthquake energy concentrating at progressively shallower depths across recent bursts of activity. Volcanic systems like this one don't escalate in a straight line, the way a countdown clock ticks steadily toward zero. They move in cycles instead. Pressure loads up, then partially releases through smaller quakes and gas venting, then loads back up again as heat and fluid keep arriving from deep below. Whether this specific cycle resolves quietly the way the 1980s crisis eventually did, or represents a genuine step toward an eruption that this particular cycle simply won't reverse, isn't something today's science can answer in advance with any real confidence. Nobody alive has ever watched this exact caldera complete a full eruptive buildup while using modern scientific instruments, because the last eruption predates essentially all of today's monitoring technology by nearly 500 years. In a very real sense, scientists are watching something genuinely unprecedented in the entire era of modern volcanic monitoring. According to the monitoring community's own established benchmarks, what would actually represent a true escalation isn't one strong quake happening in isolation. It's a tightly clustered sequence of repeated magnitude 4+ earthquakes happening within days rather than months, paired with ground uplift accelerating well past its current steady rate of about 10 millimeters a month, combined with sudden shifts in gas emissions or vent temperature at the surface that break sharply away from the long-term baseline. That specific combination of warning signs hasn't happened yet. What has happened is one genuinely severe earthquake, sitting at the upper end of this entire unrest episode, arriving directly on top of a multi-year trend that already existed before it. Researchers are treating this as a serious data point demanding close attention, not as a confirmed countdown, and not as background noise to be brushed aside either. It's also worth remembering that supervolcanoes like this one don't behave like more familiar volcanoes such as Vesuvius or Etna, where the link between unrest and an eventual eruption is more directly traceable through recorded past history. Campi Flegrei's 1538 eruption is the only one anyone has ever directly witnessed and written down in real time, and even that relatively small event was tiny compared to the truly enormous eruptions this same caldera produced tens of thousands of years earlier. Researchers are essentially working with a genuinely thin historical data set for calibrating what a modern buildup would even look like on today's far more sensitive instruments. There's also a real, more immediate risk worth understanding here, separate entirely from any question about a major future eruption. Campi Flegrei's hydrothermal system has already caused smaller localized incidents without any dramatic eruption at all being involved. Earlier this year, a gas vent opened unexpectedly and leaked gas into a nearby school building, forcing an emergency evacuation while the area was tested and properly ventilated. Shifts in underground gas pathways, sudden changes in groundwater, including reports of dormant wells and springs suddenly flowing again after major quakes, and structural damage to centuries-old buildings that were never designed for modern seismic codes are all genuine near-term concerns happening right now, regardless of what the long-term volcanic risk eventually turns out to be. A magnitude 5 class earthquake at a similarly shallow depth could plausibly cause considerably more damage than this 4.7 already did, and some researchers have specifically flagged that a strong 4.7 like this one could function as a precursor to something larger down the line, though that remains a genuine possibility being studied, not a firm prediction being made. So here's where that actually leaves us. Campi Flegrei is a genuine scientifically classified supervolcano, currently living through its most significant episode of unrest in at least 4 decades, and possibly the most significant episode in its entire instrumentally recorded history. A magnitude 4.7 earthquake, the strongest of this whole episode, just struck at an extremely shallow depth directly above its hydrothermal system, causing real damage and real injuries across Pozzuoli and western Naples. The underlying cause appears to be hydrothermal fluid pressure and deeper magmatic processes, slowly fracturing a cap rock layer that has quietly held firm for centuries. None of that gives us a confirmed eruption timeline. This remains, in the words of the researchers actually studying it, a low probability, high consequence risk, catastrophic if it ever happens, but genuinely unlikely on any single given day. It's also not a story that wraps up neatly with easy reassurance, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to make this video end on a comfortable note. This is an active, still unfolding situation sitting directly beneath a heavily populated modern city, with thousands of years of continuous human history layered on top of ground that is never fully settled. It's tracked in real time by some of the most detailed volcanic monitoring infrastructure anywhere on Earth, built specifically because Italian scientists have long understood exactly what's riding on getting this right. The honest answer to what happens next is that nobody, including the scientists watching it most closely with the best data available anywhere in the world, knows for certain. What they do know, and what they're carefully telling the public through official channels, is that the underlying trend has been moving in one direction for 6 years straight, gradually accelerating rather than settling back down. This earthquake didn't reverse that trend. It didn't offer any sign that the pressure underground is easing up. If anything, it confirmed the trend is continuing and possibly picking up pace, which is exactly why monitoring teams across the region are treating the days and weeks ahead as a genuinely important window for understanding where this actually goes next. Now let's actually talk about what any of this means for you, wherever you're watching this from, because understanding a distant volcano is interesting, but understanding your own risk is what actually changes an outcome someday. If you live anywhere near an active fault line or a volcanic region yourself, the single most useful thing you can do isn't panic, and it isn't ignoring the story either. It's knowing exactly where your gas and water shutoff valves are located and actually knowing how to use them, because gas leaks following shaking are one of the single most common causes of injury and fire after an earthquake, far more common than the shaking itself. It's keeping a battery-powered or hand-crank radio somewhere easy to reach, because when power lines come down the way they did in Naples that night, official updates and evacuation instructions often arrive over the radio long before cell service and phone networks come back online. It's storing a few days' worth of water per person in your household, because water systems can fail or become contaminated even in situations where a quake causes no other visible damage nearby at all. And it's genuinely knowing your neighbors, not just recognizing their faces, but actually knowing them, because in disaster response study after disaster response study, communities that already knew and trusted each other before an emergency recovered noticeably faster afterward than communities where everyone was still strangers. So we're back to that same pressure cooker, still sealed, still hissing quietly at the surface vents, its lid. A little more fractured today than it was a year ago. Nobody, not the scientists standing in front of the best instruments on the entire planet pointed directly at this patch of ground, can tell you today whether that lid holds for another 500 years, or whether it gives way sooner than anyone currently expects. What they can tell you, with real confidence, is that the pressure hasn't eased. It hasn't reversed direction. And on the evening of July 31st, 2026, the ground beneath nearly 1 million people made that trend very hard to keep ignoring. If you live anywhere near a fault line or a volcanic zone yourself, tell me in the comments exactly which one it is. I genuinely want to know how many of you are sitting on top of something like this without ever really thinking about it day to day. We break down a real research-backed situation like this one every single week, built from the actual published science, not just whatever the scariest headline of the day happens to be. So if this was actually useful to you, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. And if this helped you genuinely understand what's happening underground instead of just being scared by a headline about it, tap, like right now. It's the single fastest way to put this in front of someone else who's currently scrolling past this same story, feeling confused and more than a little bit worried.